The morning air carried that southern calm filled with jasmine and silent judgment, and I stood on the other side of the wrought iron gates of the San Isidro Chapel, where Ricardo's coffin rested beneath stained-glass windows and solemn prayers. From the street, I saw everything: the gleaming black hearse, the rows of luxury SUVs and sedans, and the mourners filing in, some with their heads bowed, others with friendly smiles and cell phones on silent mode. And at the center of it all, my daughter Sophia stood near the main stairs, her hands delicately folded over a bag embroidered with her initials, her black dress fitted to perfection. She wore her mourning as if it were a perfect runway show, her pose rehearsed. She looked like the grieving heiress, but none of it was real, not the tears she wiped away with a linen handkerchief, nor the greetings to family friends I hadn't seen in years, much less the way she lifted her chin when she saw me across the street. If this story touches your heart, do not forget to click subscribe and tell me in the comment what city or country you are watching from. I am truly curious to know where my voice is being heard today. Before I could take a step, two men in dark gray suits appeared on either side of the gate, saying, "Mrs. Morales, we've been asked to inform you that you may not enter." They didn't meet my eyes. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. They answered quietly, "This is my husband's funeral. I arranged his first will and cared for him through 3 surgeries. We got married in this very chapel." But the second, younger man tensed, saying, "We're sorry, ma'am, this is a private event. Miss Sophia Morales has complete control of the guest list." My phone vibrated in my purse, and I didn't need to see it to know who it was from. Still, I pulled it out and found a one-line message: "Please don't make this any more difficult than necessary." I stared at the screen as the words hit louder than the guards' voices because I didn't want a scene. She didn't want me there, not now, not with the eyes of Merida's elite watching. I backed away slowly, my heels scraping against the stone pavement. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I just stood there while my own daughter buried her father and me along with him, and that night I sat alone in the kitchen with my hands around a cooling cup of chamomile tea, staring off into space as the house was silent. Too silent for a day that should have ended with eulogies and shared tears. Tea instead ended with security guards and a message that read like a restraining order. The ache in my chest wasn't grief exactly, more like the recognition that this wasn't sudden but had been years in the making, because Sophia was never cruel as a child, but even then her smile had a certain quality to it, charming on the surface, too calculated for someone her age, and I used to think it was intelligence, though maybe it was something else. I remember the summer when she was 12 and she took my checkbook, forging my signature, to buy herself a pair of white riding boots. When I found the receipt under her mattress, she didn't cry or beg to smile, not with joy but with the confidence of someone who knows you love her too much to abandon her. I forgave her because, of course, I always did: piano recitals, scraped knees, and broken promises disguised as teenage tantrums. I forgave it all, telling myself I had to. I was the one who raised her almost alone while Ricardo traveled between cities raising capital instead of children. I stayed, prepared lunches, consoled her in her heartbreaks, and ignored every warning sign, and now here I was drinking tea in an empty house while my daughter buried my husband without me, and my email chimed, causing me to open my laptop with a heaviness I couldn't name to find a clinical matter: resolution of Ricardo Morales's inheritance, with a scanned PDF attached whose signature was recent and the language clear, establishing that everything, every peso, every property, including the mansion on Avenida Colón, was for Sophia alone, with no mention of me. I read it twice, then again as the tea cooled, but my pulse was starting to heat up because the daughter I raised hadn't just excluded me from the funeral, she'd erased me from his legacy, and yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I drove to the mansion just after dawn, the sky still purple from the remnants of the night and my hands gripping the wheel more than necessary because I hadn't slept. There were too many memories, too many of those questions that don't need answers, only acknowledgement, and when I turned onto Avenida Colón and saw the house, my breath caught in my throat, not because it was different, but because it wasn't, at least from a distance, with the gray stone facade, the tall windows, and the vine that stubbornly clung to the east wall. Everything was the same until I saw the garden. The roses were gone, the extensive flower bed of English roses Ricardo and I planted the summer we celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary ripped out, and in its place were bright white gravel and 2 symmetrical pots of cold, lifeless imported palms. It looked like the entrance to a luxury hotel, not a home. I parked at the curb and got out slowly, deliberately. My heels crunched against the gravel as I approached the front door, and through the high windows I saw the foyer where portraits from our wedding and Sophia's christening had once hung were now filled with colorless abstract canvases, lines, and triangles without memory. The door opened before I could knock, and a young housekeeper I didn't recognize, her eyes wide, heard me say, "I've come to see the house." Calmly, though my chest ached, she hesitated, saying, "Miss Morales gave clear instructions. You may not come in, ma'am." "I'm so sorry." Her voice lowered to a whisper. "She said you're no longer family." I nodded once, not in agreement, but for closure. I turned and walked back to the car, taking careful steps on the gravel that replaced the garden Ricardo tended in slippers. Humming off key, I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the mansion for a long moment as the morning sun hit the windows, but it didn't feel warm. It was like standing in front of a museum that used to be your home, a place filled with things you recognized, curated by someone who didn't understand them. The envelope arrived by courier 3 days later, cream-colored with the name of a law firm I didn't recognize, and I already knew what was inside before I opened it because Sophia had filed papers to claim the house in the Roma neighborhood, the same house Ricardo and I bought when we got married, before his company took off, before the mansion, before everything. We kept it even after we moved into the mansion because it had stories and dandined roots. My name was on the original deed, but now, according to the new documents, I was legally considered an extension of the marital property under the revised will, and I had 30 days to vacate. I didn't cry. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer next to the stove where I kept old photos and utility bills. I sat at the kitchen table for a while, tracing the pattern in the wood with a finger. That night the phone rang shortly after 10, and I almost didn't answer, thinking it was another salesperson or a wrong number. But the voice on the other end was soft and nervous. "Mrs. Morales." Yes, I was one of Mr. Morales's nurses in his final weeks. There was a long pause. She made him sign things when he was barely awake, when he was barely breathing. He didn't know what he was agreeing to. "I thought you should know." And before I could ask her name, the line went dead. The next morning, I drove straight to the bank on Alvaro Obregon Street because I hadn't opened the safe deposit box in years, not since Ricardo and I finalized some old trust arrangements. Most of our documents are digitized now, but I always insisted on keeping physical copies just in case. The clerk gave me the key and led me to the back, and when I opened the small gray door, the air inside was dry and still. Between the birth certificates and bonds was a thick manila folder labeled in Ricardo's neat handwriting, "Elena, Originals, store carefully." I stared at it for a moment before reaching for it because whatever battle Sophia thought she'd won, she'd clearly forgotten one thing. I was the one who taught Ricardo how to protect what mattered. I hadn't spoken to Clara Rendon in almost 5 years, but she answered my call on the first ring, telling me, "No beating around the bush, just bring what you have, I'll be here," and her office hadn't changed. It was still filled with heavy oak shelves and framed degrees from UNAM and Harvard because Clara always conducted herself like a woman who didn't need to prove anything. She poured us both coffee without asking and closed the door behind me. I slid the folder across her desk, and she flipped through the documents, her eyes narrowing, her brow furrowing with each page. When she got to the notarized trust agreement, she stopped and leaned back in her chair, saying, "This is gold," under her breath as I explained. "He signed it 8 years ago, right after we discovered the first tumor in his liver. We thought we'd have more time, and he never revoked it." I shook my head, explaining that no one but me even knew it existed. "We filed it quietly. It was to protect our assets in case things went south quickly. It names me as trustee. All property, including the mansion, passes to me and then to future grandchildren, if Sophia has any." Clara looked at me with something close to admiration, saying, "This voids the will." "She buried you while you were still breathing," but I replied, "Clara, I didn't fight at the funeral, And I didn't scream when she changed the locks, but this, I touched the paper gently. Here I draw the line. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly, saying, we'll file a motion to contest the will and invoke the trust. It won't be simple, but this is solid. You were silent, but not blind. I replied, I learned from the best, but the words weighed more than I expected because the best, Ricardo, was gone, and the person I loved most in the world was now someone I had to face in court. While Clara prepared the first round of documents, I folded my hands in my lap and looked out her office window at the city where I'd built a life. A storm was brewing. I'd waited long enough, and Clara filed the motion 2 days after our meeting. By the time I returned home, the courthouse docket already listed a case number, my name next to Sophia's in the cold neutrality of legal print. The wheels had begun to turn. That week, I made discreet calls to people who had once filled the mansion's halls with movement and care, housekeepers, gardeners, and even the florist who delivered the same white lilies Ricardo ordered for our anniversary. Most were gone, their answers polite and Dandan professionally distant, with only one agreeing to meet with me. Tomas Aguilar had been our gardener for almost 12 years and found me in a small cafe in the Condesa neighborhood, his hands weathered and his voice low, telling me, she started replacing us as soon as Mr. Morales became too sick to walk. She said she wanted staff who wouldn't cling to the past, that's how she put it. And when I asked, everyone who remembered me, he nodded, explaining, by the time Ricardo passed away, there was no one left who knew what that place was like before. When I returned home, I sat down with the laptop Ricardo had used in the end, the one Sofia hadn't thought to lock. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some calendar reminder emails, but one message stood out, sent to an old personal contact of his, someone from the investment firm days, with no subject line, just a sentence, if anything happens, Elena knows where the truth is. The time stamp was 5 weeks before his death. I read it again and again, trying to read between the lines already loaded with meaning. He hadn't told me about the message. He didn't warn me about Sofia's intentions, but in the fog of his final weeks, he'd left a sign, not for lawyers, not for the public, but for me. I lay back with my eyes closed as the silence of the house enveloped me like a breath held too long. Whatever piece was still hidden, Ricardo trusted me to find it, and that meant it was time to stop remembering and start proving. Clara acted quickly, and the trust document I'd taken from the bank was in perfect condition, witnessed, notarized, and backed by a digital verification record. Ricardo's signature was clear, dated, and stored on a time certification platform I insisted on using back when cloud systems were new to estate law. He had pleased me then, and now it was my strongest shield. We sent it to the court with the initial motion. The document stated clearly that I was the trustee of all major assets, financial accounts, property, and intellectual property until Sofia turned 50, and that was the only way I could have been a trustee. She was 42, that gave me 8 years of control, 8 years she hadn't foreseen. Sofia was delivered the notice at her boutique yoga studio in Polanco, mid-class wearing lilac leggings and a microphone on her head. The messenger told me later that she didn't flinch, accepted the envelope, read the front page, and calmly continued her class. The next morning, a reporter for the Yucatan newspaper published a short article quoting her directly. My mother and I were estranged. She abandoned my father long before he passed away. I was the one who stayed. I handled everything when he was weakest. There was also a photo of Sofia beside the studio with her arms crossed, her expression soft but firm, the kind of face that wins sympathy from those who only read headlines. I didn't respond to the press, the murmurs, or the neighbors who began offering tense condolences at the market as if I had committed something unforgivable. Instead, I forwarded the article to Clara, who responded with a line, "That's all we needed, because if Sofia truly believed the trust was worthless, she wouldn't have gone to the media and Dandan wouldn't have tried to rewrite the story before the court heard it." I printed the article and filed it in the same folder that now contained Ricardo's trust, his email, and a paper trail that said this battle wasn't about emotions anymore, it was about evidence, and I was almost ready to put it all out in the open. The courthouse was small, with no cameras, no grand jury, just soft lights and the echo of shoes on the polished floor. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Clara, hands folded, the trust file between us, like a sealed chapter waiting to be read aloud. Sophia walked in 5 minutes late, wearing black, always wearing black. Her lawyer, young, talkative, and overconfident, opened with a speech about filial duty and emotional strain. He called the revised will a clear expression of Mr. Morales's final clarity, but clarity doesn't empty accounts. When Clara took the floor, she was calm and surgical. She began with the notarized, time-stamped trust, filed in physical and digital format. She presented the record showing Ricardo's last full mental capacity, supported by medical records and an affidavit from the attending physician. Then came the nurse's testimony. She read it herself, her voice trembling slightly as she recalled Ricardo barely conscious during the signing of documents that Sophia insisted were urgent. The judge didn't interrupt once. The notaries followed, one from the original trust, another from the contested will. Only one remembered Ricardo speaking clearly, and it wasn't the last. Sophia never looked me in the eye, not when financial records were presented showing a silent transfer of nearly 12 million pesos from Ricardo's account to one in her name 3 weeks before his death, nor when the judge paused for almost 30 seconds before issuing the ruling. The trust, having been created and preserved under legal and verifiable circumstances, will be respected in its entirety, she said. The will presented by the defendant is declared invalid. The words fell without celebration. Clara placed a hand gently on mine, but I didn't move. Sophia stood, didn't speak, lips pressed together, shoulders square. She turned and left. Like someone leaving a stage that collapsed behind them, I stayed seated even after the judge left and the courthouse emptied, because what I'd fought for wasn't just a house or a set of bank accounts, it was the right to say he hadn't forgotten me, not, in the end, not when it mattered. 3 weeks passed since the ruling, and the newspapers called it a quiet victory in court. Neighbors said hello again. Clara filed the last forms, and the keys to the mansion arrived by courier along with a handwritten inventory of what remained inside, furniture, ledgers, and a few oil paintings that escaped Sophia's renovations. I still hadn't decided what to do with it all. Then, one morning, my phone vibrated just after dawn with a voicemail with no caller ID. Her voice was lower than I remembered. "You took everything, I hope you're happy." There was a long pause, as if she hadn't wanted to say more, but then, just trying to hold on to something that still felt like him. The message ended silently, with no apology, no anger, just that thread of something close to regret, though never named. I didn't return the call. Instead, I took the trust documents, put them in a plain manila envelope, and added a note, "For your records." Then I highlighted a line in orange before sealing it, not a legal line, not one that would carry any weight in court, it was an addendum. Ricardo insisted on writing himself, tucked near the end, beneath the signatures, "May this house one day teach you what family means." I sent it to her study with no return address because she would know who it came from. The next day, I drove to the mansion for the first time since the judgment, parked in the circular drive, and walked slowly through the front doors. I'd chosen myself long before Sophia learned to use silence as a weapon. The air inside was still, untouched, her perfume was gone, and her furniture had been cleared away. What remained was space, light, and memory. I stood in the foyer and let the silence speak, then I passed the stairs, went through the back doors, and arrived at what had once been my garden. I didn't move again, not because I couldn't or because the room still held shadows of his presence. I didn't move because it was never meant to be mine alone. The house was always a symbol of what Ricardo built, of what we tried to preserve, but symbols rot if they hold on too tightly. So I donated it to the Yucatan Arts and Education Foundation, which was looking for a permanent home for after-school programs and community workshops. Now they had 22 rooms and a restored garden. They asked if I wanted a plaque with my name on it. I declined, suggesting they use Ricardo's name, the Morales House, a legacy of learning and community. On my last visit before the handover, I brought a rosebush, not from a nursery, but from a cutting I'd saved in a ceramic pot behind the Roma house. It was from the original garden, our garden, the one we planted the year Sophia was born. I dug the hole myself in the corner where the shade fell just right, knelt in the soft earth, and pressed the roots carefully into the ground. My knees ached, and my hands weren't as steady as they'd once been, but the rhythm of planting was familiar and silent. No one looked, and no one needed to. As I stood, brushing the soil from my palms, I felt a light breeze move the leaves. It was the same corner where Ricardo once told me that some things are built not to last forever but to mean something while they are there. They say the dead leave behind possessions, but sometimes they also leave us with choices, and I chose not to let betrayal become my legacy. The papers were signed that afternoon. The foundation would begin its work the next month. I left with nothing in the back seat except an empty flower pot and a lightness I hadn't carried in years, because sometimes the most lasting legacy isn't in what you keep, it's in what you give away.